Hello again, and welcome to another edition of Analytics Lab by Engage Rocket. Today, we're going to be covering how to use continuous listening in your employee experience strategy. Now, continuous listening has become a new buzzword in the people space or HR space, and it's really quite a shift away from what we've been used to in terms of the annual engagement survey and the way that we've used to be tracking and listening to employee feedback. But what exactly does this mean, and how do we actually go about executing something like this in our company? So today, what I hope to do with all of you is to be able to unpack this, to highlight certain experiences that we've had across the 30-odd thousand users on Engage Rocket in 13 different markets in Asia Pacific. So bear with me 1 second as I share my screen with you. So at Engage Rocket, our mission is to build better workplaces with people analytics. And we do this by improving the employee experience using real-time feedback and analytics across the employee lifecycle. And my name is Chi Tong. I'm the co-founder and CEO. And I'm going to be starting with the macro view. So taking a step back, looking at the new normal that business is operating in today, there are a few different mega trends that are affecting all of us. The first one is having to deal with a multi-generational workforce. What we've found in many companies is that the retirement age is actually getting later and later. This is partly because our lifespans are increasing as humans, but also partly because the nature of work has become more knowledge-driven and less physically intensive. The other trend that's contributing towards this is that people are starting to enter the workforce at a younger and younger age, partly to gain experience and partly because of the nature of employment contracts today being more flexible. You might, in some companies, get employees who are 17 years of age having to work with employees who are 70 years of age. From a leadership and HR perspective, how do we cater the employee value proposition to all of these different generations of talent in our workforce? And how do we then go about getting them to work well together? These are some of the challenges that are presented by this particular megatrend. The second element of the new normal is that organizational transformation is upon all of us. Change is very much the new constant, and we can't expect our organizations to stay the same and to deepen competencies and having the luxury of years to do that. Today, nimble and being agile is part and parcel of winning in the marketplace. So companies need to keep transforming to stay ahead of the pack. What kind of impact does this have on our people? And how do we ensure that the people that are driving the company forward are going to be on board with all of these different changes that we are beset by? The third element of the new normal is a talent market that is becoming more and more fragmented. And what this means is that different silos of expertise are being created today that may not have existed before. And these, in each of these silos, there are different specializations that matter. For example, if we look at just 20 years ago, the idea of a digital marketer or the idea of a data scientist having a major place to play in our economy was not even something that was on the horizons of any of our predictions. But today, you have performance marketers, you have SEO marketers, and all kinds of different specialists. And even in the data science arena, AI or artificial intelligence is one big umbrella term that encapsulates many different aspects of data science. So how do companies then work with all of these different types of expertise? And also, how do companies work with gig workers and interact with the gig economy, where the contingent workforce may potentially play quite a significant role in the production of goods and services today? So all of this becomes something that companies need to get used to and collect data on how to operate more effectively in. Finally, new employee expectations have arisen for various reasons. So in most cases where there are new jobs, we find that the people in those jobs might actually have more technical expertise than their bosses. So that flips the power relationship from before, where perhaps in the old industrial revolution, where bosses had become bosses because they'd done that same role uh, and achieved some level of expertise in it. Where today bosses are bosses primarily because, hopefully, of their ability to marshal and harness the the talent of the people that they are working with. And because of that, they then need to have a more or rather a flatter uh, degree of hierarchy in dealing with some of these new employees. So we find also that there are many technology companies that have changed the game when it has come to the workplace and creating different working environments for employees, whether it's remote work or flexible work. This has all become part of the new normal and has become an important component of the employee value proposition for many talent in the market today. All of this is happening while business is being conducted at a far faster pace than ever before. When we looked at this study of companies in the S&P 500 in the 1920s, their average lifespan on that index was 67 years at that time. Today, that has been compressed to just 15 years. So what that means is that these companies now have just 15 years to make a difference and to stay relevant. With the pace of business be moving this quickly, it no longer is possible for leaders and HR to adopt a wait and see policy when it comes to deciding how to improve people management for their teams. So this brings us to the evolution of employee engagement through all of these different macro trends. When we look at the economics of this, or economics of employee engagement, on average, it takes about $57,000 to replace one person. So this comes not just from the costs of recruiters, but also from the costs of interviewing and hiring another replacement, the lost productivity that this person will cause from training in their ramp time, as well as some of the lost productivity from the people on their team in covering their work. What is really scary about this number is that this is only at the junior to mid level of organizations. If you're looking at the middle to more senior levels of organizations, this number can easily be 2 or 3 times higher, or even more at the most senior levels. At the same time, when we look at the upside of the employee experience, we find that companies with highly engaged employees actually are able to generate earnings per share of 147% higher than other benchmark companies. They're also able to generate 51% more profit, and their people are also 21% more productive. So when we look at the upsides of employee improving and optimizing the employee experience, and compared against the downside of having employee disengagement, it does become a bit of a no-brainer that companies need to invest greater effort and energy in thinking about how we can reliably improve the employee experience across the entire life cycle of an employee. But when we look at feedback today and capturing data on the employee experience today, this hasn't been working in many companies. First, we find that because there isn't much feedback that's being collected, or the feedback is being collected in a scattershot way, most leaders end up making people decisions using gut feel instead of actually turning to data. Big driver of this is because the feedback that they do get tends to be relatively slow, and because it's slow, it also is irrelevant to their current situation. And finally, because of all of this, we find that this becomes a bit of a checkbox exercise when it comes to taking surveys. It becomes a compliance uh, initiative, and business units force their employees to take these surveys just to ensure that HR gets off their back. So overall, when we look at the evolution, we started out at, say, employee engagement 0.0, where feedback is collected ad hoc, qualitatively, and people decisions are made mostly by gut feel and anecdotal evidence. Unfortunately, this describes still today quite a large number of companies. Many companies, however, have moved on to employee engagement 1.0, which deals with primarily the top-down annual engagement survey. So this is done, we use annual here quite loosely. It could be once a year, once every 2 to 3 years as well, or even on a relatively ad hoc basis. So because it is done so infrequently, we tend to pack a lot of questions into these surveys, and the insights tend also to be quite generic because they're done so infrequently, and we're trying to achieve so many different objectives in a single survey. And therefore, the focus then becomes a lot on benchmarking, comparing our company against how other companies in our industry or our region are doing. And those metrics then become used a little bit like vanity metrics, where we can either say that we're doing great compared to others in our industry, or these norms are telling us that we're quite behind versus other companies of our nature. And that in itself is not entirely useless, but it's limited in how valuable it actually is in terms of driving action. The other limitation of employee engagement 1.0 is the fact that because it is a top-down survey, communication tends to be one way, and employees provide responses to the survey but may or may not hear back from the leadership. So this brings us to employee engagement 2.0 today, which some companies have already been moving into. So this is driven primarily using continuous listening and action. It allows companies to run agile surveys over the life cycle of their employees, and from that, being able to run good targeted analyses to allow for intelligent action planning that is timely and relevant. And because a lot of this is technology driven, we are then able to see companies use two-way multi-channel feedback and to react and respond to employee feedback in real time. So what all of this does is it generates insights across the employee lifecycle. So from the time that an employee joins the company, over here on the left of this chart, we find that their output increases slowly and then plateaus off before they then leave the company. So by generating lifecycle insights, what you want to see is that during the onboarding period, when an employee has just joined you, you want to be able to collect feedback about the onboarding process to optimize it for productivity, to shorten ramp time for that particular employee and get them productive faster. During the onboarding period and assimilating them into the rest of the company culture, what we can do with engagement feedback can also be to help improve how high they can go in terms of their performance by collecting and using data to improve the developmental uh, capabilities of our organization to grow our people. We can then also increase how much higher their output can be over time. And a sum of all of this is improving the employee value proposition to allow them to stay longer and to find more value in staying longer with your organization than compared with not using employee lifecycle insights. So from this chart, looking at the area under the curve will give you a sense of the life cycle productivity of that particular employee. Without applying any of these insights, this is the total productivity that you can expect to achieve from your employees. But using life cycle insights, you'll be able to achieve this much more productivity from each employee. So the trick then becomes, how do we apply this scalably across all of our employees and achieve this kind of results more predictably and regularly? So what we're going to offer today is 4 best practices that we've seen in our work with up to 30,000 different users in 13 different markets in Asia Pacific. When it comes to using a continuous listening process in their employee experience strategy. So we're sharing here some of what we've learned to work best with some of our customers and in our research in the industry. So the first practice that we find the best companies do is to design the right feedback architecture. So what do we mean by this? It all starts out with a business hypothesis. So being able to define a hypothesis of what exactly is it that HR or your people ops team wants to do starts with building a question or a statement that can be proven or disproven. For example, one hypothesis might be that people leave my company in the first 90 days if they're not successfully engaged by the hiring manager. So we note that the characteristics of a good hypothesis are that it's not the research question. It is also phrased as a statement. It's phrased in clear language and is testable. So you can find data that will prove or disprove this particular statement. So for example, you then start with that hypothesis to look into who do we then need to sample in terms of who do we need to collect data from. So for example, if your hypothesis was on first 90-day attrition, we might then decide that we want to sample and focus surveys on just the new joiners within the 90-day period that they've just joined the company. The next thing that you want to decide on in terms of building an architecture, a feedback architecture, is the periodicity. So once you've decided who it is that you want to sample, you then want to decide how often should we sample them to be able to get good data. So given that this is a 90-day window, it's a very tight window for data collection. And we want to be able to then also collect data, say, for example, every month. Part of the reason for that is because in the first 90 days, we know that for new joiners, their experience changes from what they knew very quickly. So we want to have a high level of periodicity to find out good data from that window. However, if you're looking at something that's a bit more enterprise-wide, you might want to choose a periodicity that aligns more closely with the natural business rhythm of of your company. The other thing to note is that also every survey, every question sends a signal to employees. So in designing your feedback architecture, you want to convey the signal, number one, that you care, but also number two, that you respect the data that they're giving you and the time that they're taking to provide you that feedback. So being able to balance all of that within the feedback architecture is very important. The second best practice that we've seen is that companies who use continuous listening well, don't try to boil the ocean. They look at and target and prioritize the right segments and the right projects to be able to collect feedback on. And the project of continuous listening itself actually becomes a little bit more of a non-project because it is applied to support existing business initiatives. So this solves a lot of the relevance problems that come up with traditional once a year big bang surveys, but it also allows a focus of effort on where it matters most to the business. So looking at where and how to allocate the resources more intelligently to maximize the ROI, and asking yourself like which is most critical within the employee life cycle right now, and then where therefore should we focus our energies in collecting information first. So instead of boiling the ocean, you want to isolate certain areas that you want to focus on. The third best practice has been to effectively then segment out the, the population that you're sampling and to map out different employee journeys and pain points that they might be going through. So this allows you to create a one size fits one approach to engaging your employees instead of adopting a one size fits all approach. So being able to narrow down the analysis by segment is extremely critical in being able to do that so that you can address the pain points and in that part of the journey more accurately. Also, being able to collect and process natural language is also critical. So being able to identify the sentiments of those open-ended responses in surveys, for example, and then correlate them and filter them by different attributes. And finally, also to be able to analyze what are the different topics that people are talking about and how important are they relatively to driving engagement, employee experience, attrition, and performance. For the staff, one of the biggest things that we've noticed is that in giving their feedback, a lot of the times that they feel dissatisfied by providing an answers to their surveys is because they don't know that their voice is heard. So being able to get a platform that allows you to acknowledge feedback that's given, as well as to potentially even clarify certain questions that or concerns that are raised by your staff, so that in an anonymized window for psychological safety, may be quite important in building a, a continuous listening platform and driving that change through successfully. Finally, the fourth best practice we found is that companies that build continuous listening strategies strive towards having a single source of truth. What does this mean? So today we collect in our companies, obviously, the employee engagement surveys, which we run on a regular basis. But at the same time, we also find ourselves collecting quite a lot of other data on our employee experience and performance. So we have you might find that some of these are collected via surveys which are run by either the business units themselves or the business partners. Some are run by external consultants. Some are run on your current HRMS systems. And while the HRMS systems are generally very good at collecting operational HR data, we find that there isn't yet an easy way to pull together all of these different data sources and data streams into a single source of truth where you can therefore make meaningful insights. So what we've been trying to do and what we've seen to work quite well is to collect all of them within a single platform, which then allows you to run more meaningful analyses to personalize the employee experience. So instead of getting shallow insights from each individual data collection silo, you can then overcome these silos and get analytical consistency, having a single source of data syntax, having the data talk to each other, and be able to track responses across the life cycle at the individual level, and yet maintaining confidentiality when it's needed so that you can deal with sensitive feedback. Now I'd like to dive into a couple of case studies where we've seen this work well and maybe not so well. So the first case that we're going to look at is in the heavy industry, where a company they started out using quite traditional performance management systems, and then they moved towards a more listening program, a continuous listening program that ran weekly surveys with actually amazingly a more than 80% participation rate. What we found was that without a hypothesis at the beginning, this particular company actually ended up facing what we call survey fatigue. The staff, while they were participating in the surveys, they were just going through the motion really. And we saw this because the response variation wasn't high from week to week. And because there was no connection to the actual business, this while it was admirable that they were able to drive this change through, to be able to do this at such a high level of participation over the course of the year, it turned out not to be very helpful for the business. A company that has done it well and has a published case study on this is John Deere. So this company, they manufacture agricultural equipment, and in in a similar industry. What they did was, because they moved over to a more agile performance management within the teams that ran these continuous listening programs, they were then able to deploy uh, advanced listening, and they surveyed their employees every 2 weeks. And what this did was it created an open communication culture in teams that were already running Scrum processes with 2 week sprints. So the the cadence of data collection was matched with the cadence of the business, and this allowed HR to actually intervene only on the urgent issues. For most teams, for most weeks and most sprints, there actually weren't any critical interventions that were required, but it provided them with a means to intervene in advance when absolutely necessary. So they were then able to take team-based decisions around these task-centered sprints. And in such an environment, the motivation of each team member is actually critical because of the relatively low level of supervision and high degree of autonomy that each team has. If they were not engaged, if they did not have a good employee experience, it was very easy to waste a number of sprints, and therefore to start derailing your progress and performance. So they found that being able to track this kind of the employee experience at such a high frequency that was aligned with the high frequency and the high pace of their business was extremely critical for them. The second example that we found was a company in the retail F&B sector, which actually faced quite high turnover, where they ended up, if you analyzed their attrition, it cost them 15 to 20% of all their entire expense on staff, just in hiring and onboarding new joiners who would leave potentially in the first 30 days. So they tried to roll out a new continuous listening program, um, and they did face some challenges in this. The participation rate for the very first survey that they ran was only 25%, or less than 25%. So from this, we found that a few lessons, and these might not be rocket science for you, but communication was absolutely critical. When the program was run, because this was the first time that the project team has run such a project, there was some underestimation in how much communication to the line was necessary, and when it did go out, it was relatively weak, and therefore many people in the front lines were not clear about why they needed to participate in some of these surveys. With some assistance on our side, I think it rang some alarm bells as well when we saw their participation rate at this level. We then started to provide more support to help their team to communicate better, and to also advise them a little bit on what we've seen to be successful change management in other companies. And this was really taking a more progressive approach to change, easing them into such a listening program. And the good news is that the uh, the participation rates then soared in the next few surveys. They went up to above 85 to 90%. And they were able to then close or bring this initiative closer to a broader based intervention program that they were developing in-house. So this was a near miss on our part as well, and we're glad that it eventually was able to get back on track downstream. A company that did do this well was Clark's. So they started out their continuous listening program with a clear objective and hypotheses, and they really wanted to find out uh, the link between employee engagement and performance. So they already started out with a high level of engagement, but by tying this initiative closer to performance, they were then able to get quite key actionable insights and use those insights to build an engagement toolkit that was allowing them to improve performance at their different stores. And throughout this entire process, they maintained a hypothesis and data-driven approach, which allowed them to very quickly iterate their initiatives and learn as they grew. So here are some pitfalls to avoid. The first is when you're starting out, you don't want to link any results of your continuous listening programs to compensation. That just creates the wrong incentives in an organization that may not be ready yet to link it to compensation. This is not saying that you don't want to do this possibly at some point down the line, but definitely at the beginning, this is not something that you want to do. The second thing that you want to avoid is starting with everything at once or trying to boil the ocean. So if you're going from a 0.0 state to a complete 2.0 state, where you're asking from 0 surveys to suddenly 15 surveys across different segments of the population, our experience has been that it doesn't work very well from a change management perspective. But on the other hand, if you start too small to build a meaningful success case, you're always going to be swimming upstream in trying to convince other business units that this could work for them as well. So you want to be able to select business units where success will be meaningful and scalable across the rest of the organization. So not too small, but also not too big. So you want to find that Goldilocks zone where you can build a good proof of concept. You also want to avoid assuming that all insight generated from such listening programs are going to be earth-shattering and counterintuitive. By and large, what we find is that a lot of the data that's collected serves to support the intuition that our HR business partners and chief people officers already have about our people. Generally speaking, the strength of HR teams is in understanding an intuitive on the intuitive level, like what the people are believing and thinking. So what the data does show is that in most cases that these intuitions may be right, and then when the intuitions are wrong, the data then becomes quite useful and helpful in driving different processes. The fifth pitfall to avoid is, of course, not starting. So just because there is a little bit of change management effort required to start does not mean that you should not start. In our experience, the market is quickly moving towards engagement 2.0. And unless you're content to lose a lot of your best talent to such other companies that are already on this journey, it is better to start now and make mistakes and learn from them than to be afraid of making those mistakes and not starting at all. So with that, this brings us to the end of this particular edition of the Analytics Lab. Please do contact me if you have any questions at all. I do reply to all emails. And meanwhile, if you don't want to wait for an email reply, and please feel free to just type your questions in the box, and we'll make sure to get back to them as quickly as we can. Thanks very much for staying with us all this while, and we hope to see you again really soon. Take care.